So Marty asked me to talk about invasive pests and really their impacts in horticultural crops, specifically high-value specialty crops. So my goal for this presentation, it's going to be kind of rapid fire, but what I want to demonstrate is just how much work it takes when you do have an invasive species, an insect, enter the system, and also compare and contrast some of the challenges we have with different types of pests. So to begin, when I started my career and I worked in tree fruit, we didn't think much about invasive species. We did have Japanese beetle that could be an occasional pest on some cultivars of fruit. And we sometimes would hear about Asian ladybird beetle, which was actually introduced as a biocontrol agent, but became a pest in things like wine grapes. But during the latter part of my career, it's all invasives all day long. And so all of these pests I've been involved with: spotted winged Drosophila, brown marmorated stink bug, spotted lanternfly, and most recently chili thrips. So today, what I want to do is just kind of talk about these two pests because they provide the opportunity to compare the different kinds of challenges that we face with different pest species, and also including their regulatory status. So both of these are invasive species. Brown marmorated is native to China, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. And spotted lanternfly, also a hemipteran, is native to China, India, and Vietnam. There are some differences, and Shelby talked a little bit about brown marmorated stink bug. They overwinter as adults. We can have the potential for multiple generations per year. This, in contrast with spotted lanternfly, has a single generation per year, at least so far. And this is important because when we start to think about detecting a new insect and how quickly those populations can build, you see the difference. So brown marmorated stink bug was likely introduced into eastern Pennsylvania in the 1990s. It wasn't officially identified until 2001. This was my first interaction with one, and it was the first specimen outside Pennsylvania. I found it on a gas pump, majestically poised in Hagerstown, Maryland. But just, a single bug. Spotted lanternfly, what is it with Eastern Pennsylvania? I want to know. Lanternfly was introduced somewhere around 2014. This is when I first went to view them with my colleague Julie Urban at Penn State, and we just would see a few around. It wasn't too bad, but once an invasive species is detected, this is just sort of my bullets for things we should think about. We've got to recognize we're already behind. It's already there, and it's already causing problems. And so pretty soon you start to see these really crazy, explosive populations later in the invasion process. And so with both of these insects, the question, how do we catch up, is really based on building very collaborative and inclusive teams. And this includes researchers, extension educators, the regulatory personnel, industry, and also the stakeholders involved, so that we are doing the work that they need right away. And so I just have to give a shout out to the Northeastern IPM Center, who has been very instrumental with both of these insects, funding these working groups that allow these groups to come together. And they're really important because what happens next is that we start to develop these priorities. And when you're talking about invasive insects, we usually try to work in short, medium, and long-term framework, which is a little bit kind of sounds Captain Obvious, but at the same time, it really provides an optimal workflow for these insects. So you're welcome, Deb. What did I do? Oh, God. Okay, I'm back. Okay. Nobody send me a chat. So two things to point out with this pest. So brown marmorated, when it hit and became a major pest, it was already deregulated. Spotted lanternfly remains a regulated pest. So what that means is any work that we want to do with it, we either have to be in a quarantine zone and be given permission from the State Department of Ag to continue that work, or in a quarantine facility. So that's just something to keep in mind when you look at these priorities. And what I'm going to do for the rest of this talk is just talk about some of the pieces that we develop for each of these short, medium, and long-term priorities. So first of all, we have to identify the crops that are actually at risk when these insects show up. And one of the key issues that we've had with brown marmorated stink bug, it was pretty easy. They feed directly on the fruit. These are both Mithra. They have piercing, sucking mouth parts, but they're very different pests. So you're going to see that damage. You can see at the top series of photos, you see the insects feeding, and then you can see what the damage looks like below. So it happens pretty quickly. And these impacts, when we have these outbreak populations, for example, in 2010, we had $37 million in losses in apple. That year in the mid-Atlantic, 50% of the stone fruit was lost, and there was just widespread damage on fruiting vegetables and row crops as well. Contrast that with lanternfly, which is an indirect pest. It feeds through the woody tissue on phloem, and so it does stress the plant, but it takes much longer to see those impacts. And then you have abiotic stresses and their interactions that may, or other biotic factors that may exacerbate that further. So a much longer period of time. So for brown marmorated stink bug, within a couple of years, we were able to identify crops that were at high, moderate, or low risk, or even no risk, as well as identifying a lot of hosts that were host plants in North America, and we still maintain that list. And we learned pretty quickly that orchard crops and stone fruit and pome fruit were really the highest risk. With lanternfly, we have lots of insects feeding on lots of different plants, but you know, we didn't know what they could be, how they could be impacting these plants, and was it going to be a crop at risk? So the way we started to try to learn about this was to, first of all, go to the native range. So in China, we were able to look at a lot of literature, of course, and then also recently invaded countries like South Korea. South Korea, I was able to visit just before the pandemic, and you know, they talked a lot about wine grapes and feeding on vines, causing wilting, stunting, sooty mold growth, that sort of thing. And then the picture on the right is from the Seoul Arboretum. This is a Manchurian walnut that endured multiple seasons of feeding, and you can see the decline and dieback. So we thought that these might be crops at risk. There was also indications of timber, ornamental trees, tree fruit, stone fruit, the list goes on and on. But for us to kind of quantify those, it takes a while. So we began with a lot of, again, literature searches, but also direct observations in the field. And pretty quickly, we developed a list of over 100 different plant species with a narrowing diet as the insect matures. So that was good. But in terms of crops at risk, we still weren't sure. The other thing that happened was that certainly Tree of Heaven, it's a favorite host in the native range. It's absolutely a favorite host in the US as well. And obviously this is an invasive plant here in the US. And so you have an invasive plant with an invasive insect feeding on it and doing really well. So that kind of became our positive control for a series of studies that we had to conduct in quarantine, where we were looking at the potential for this insect to survive and develop on different, possibly different specialty crop hosts like apple, peach, and muscadine grape. We found pretty quickly that they actually couldn't even complete development to the adult stage, which was encouraging. But as we continued to go through these lists of plants, one that came up, and it was verified, obviously, based on what we had learned from South Korea, was Vitis vinifera, wine grapes. Is a very good host. They can complete development on it, and it's really at high risk for economic damage. So that was not good, but this is what we do as quickly as possible. The other thing, though, we were concerned about young apple and peach trees, a younger plant, vigorous feeding, what could happen. The point of this is that it took us 3 seasons, 2.5 years to get this information to say, no impacts on apple, based on these studies where we were doing development and survivorship on these hosts in the field. We did see some impacts on peach, particularly reduced growth in the first season and an increase in frost damage the following year, probably because they were feeding and removing nutrients, making the plant a little more stressed. But again, it's just the fact that it takes longer. So that's sort of impact. So the next question is, okay, now we have to have sort of short-term management tools where none exist for crops that we think are at risk. And I just want to emphasize that this is just another piece that we have to define so that growers can survive and make it through these periods where there's still a lot of uncertainty. And so for brown marmorated stink bug, for example, we had this terrible observation that we learned about pretty quickly, which was these zombie stink bugs, which basically means when a grower would go out and apply an insecticide, they would see a carpet of seemingly dead stink bugs on the ground. But 24 and 48 hours later, they were recovering and climbing back up into the trees. So that was problematic. And so it was problematic. So we had to redesign how we looked at insecticides and looked at them over time. And what you can see in these two graphs are this opportunity for knockdown and recovery. So for permethrin, a good old pyrethroid, we see increasing death over time. For a sale, a neonicotinoid, you do see that knockdown and recovery. On day 0, mostly moribund, we would assume they would die, but over time, they came back to life and started feeding and foraging. So that was a problem. But over time, and with lanternfly, we were able to show that, hey, you could kill them with a lot of things. Fortunately, they're easy to kill. For brown marmorated, hard to kill. And in fact, in a lot of crops that are on the tree for a long time, tree fruit crops, we ended up having to work with USDA's Office of Pest Management Policy and EPA's Office of Pesticide Policy to get 2 emergency use exemptions for insecticides that growers could use late in the season just to make it through. These were dinotefuran and bifenthrin. To date, we haven't had to do this for lanternfly, but unfortunately, this is a new invasive, and this is hot off the press from this fall. This is a demonstration, and Julie Urban said I could share it with all of you, where mechanically harvested grapes, what happens? So the thing to know about grape production, there are almost no sprays and almost none or none close to harvest. And so what Julie's team did was to go through and count the number of spotted lanternflies on the vines and then run a mechanical harvester through. What you can see is 60% of those that were counted on the vines on average ended up in these 1.5 ton grape collection bins. So the potential for taint is huge. So now we're looking at a Section 18 working group for this pest as well. So now we have some insecticides, but we still need to learn more about the pest itself so we can really start to design strategies for their management and look at their biology, ecology, and behavior. And so usually, and this takes a team of people, I'm just highlighting a couple of pieces for each of these pests. Brown marmorated, highly prolificous, feeds on wild and cultivated hosts. Both nymphs and adults can cause damage. They also can disperse long distances. Adults can fly more than 2 kilometers in a day. So that means they can move among farms. And even nymphs have the capacity to move 25 meters a day. So the potential for them to move among crops is there. Also, we worked with the USDA's Detector Dog Training Center to show that these insects are overwintering not just in people's homes where people usually think of them, but also in woodlots with large propagules in woodlots. And that means there is a concealed population that is not being managed throughout much of the time that they are alive, contributing to the problems in the spring when they can emerge and come into fields. And also, as Shelby demonstrated, we have bivoltinism in many regions. For spotted lanternfly, we again have a pretty prolificous pest, but in both life stages, nymphs and adults can cause damage, but the adults are far more serious. Also, we have a real problem with human-assisted dispersal, both from the cryptic egg masses, but also from the adults. This was a study published by one of my former postdocs recently showing that they can cling onto vehicles going 60 miles an hour in these locations. And the thing about spread of invasive species, it's the rare events that matter. And so these insects are able to move on vehicles, on trains, and we can see that in the spread of this insect along railway lines and major highways. They also, this is just to show you that they can do it. They also can, just in case you didn't believe me.
That's your car, right?
Yeah, well, sometimes, yeah. I live right in it. Yeah. So far they're univoltine, but the problem is these guys can disperse from unmanaged areas just like ground marmorated into vulnerable crops repeatedly. I know it's funny, isn't it, Shelby? Okay. Okay, so what does this mean? We have landscape level pests that can invade crops from the outside and continuously infest and cause problems. And so these are the kind of pests we're dealing with, both with an indirect and a direct fruit feeding pest. So this means we need monitoring tools, and there's a reason for this. When growers don't have monitoring tools, they do what you see on the left, which is literally a calendar spray schedule just for brown marmorated stink bug. So we have to rapidly try to develop these monitoring tools so growers can detect their presence relative to abundance and seasonal activity, so they can make good management decisions. And then in at-risk regions or countries who are trying to detect and exclude these insects also have something available. So fortunately for brown marmorated stink bug, within 2 years of this insect hitting the scene, we had a pheromone and a pheromone synergist. It was validated across the country and commercialized rapidly. In fact, our team worked with commercial companies and collaborators and these big teams to really get these products on the market quickly. So this was a really huge piece. And you note that I've been talking about all of this as short term. We finally hit something that was in the medium term category, and we actually developed some decision support tools, but you can see how much time it took us just to get there. For lanternfly, it's been a challenge. Everybody started with, this is what we had, these sticky bands, but obviously these sticky bands are problematic. They're in public areas, and when the public sees feathers or monarch butterflies or other critters, it's not a good thing. So again, working with teams of researchers, we were able to develop these simpler circle trap designs that reduce these non-target captures. And in fact, we've been able to work with companies and get them commercialized, but we still don't have an attractant for them. And so that's a problem. But you know, with every problem, there's always an opportunity. And so there's been some very nice work using environmental DNA, the DNA left behind by the organism foraging in the environment, where you can collect that by basically giving a plant a bath and collecting that water, concentrating the DNA for extraction, and then subjecting it to qPCR and next-gen sequencing. And this has worked really well. And Julie Lockwood's group really has developed this for some of our terrestrial organisms. This has been really good. But the most recent one, which I'm super excited about, is this idea for lanternflies using ants. You basically put out a falcon tube with a cotton ball and some honey. The ants will go in within 30 to 40 minutes. And if there are lanternflies in the area, you can get that DNA from the ants and detect them really quickly, known as aDNA right now. So it's pretty cool. A little CSI. Okay. Finally, last bit, biological control and longer term opportunities and challenges. With both brown marmorated stink bug, we had a lot of native natural enemies attacking the eggs, the nymphs, and the adults. And we ended up with our target for classical biocontrol, Trisochus japonicus, an egg parasitoid, showing up on its own. Inventive populations that have been introduced. Actually, there's probably been 3 or 4 introductions based on haplotypes. So it's out there, and within states, if the state agrees, you can redistribute that. We don't have a national permit, but we do have state by state opportunities. For lanternfly, there are studies going on for classical biocontrol, but there also have been some entomopathogenic fungi and things like that that have been identified as well. But these are really where then we can start thinking about where do we go in the long term once we know who we can use to reduce populations across the landscape. And so looking back at this list, this just shows that it takes a long time. We still have things that we haven't completed for brown marmorated stink bug, and it's been 15 years. And for lanternfly, it's been just about a decade. And so I just want to mention these last couple of points. Legacy costs. You know, when a new invasive insect enters the system, the costs remain long beyond that just initial outbreak. So growers In response to the increasing cost of dealing with this insect, they turn to cheaper materials like pyrethroids, which lead to secondary pest problems, or they drop more expensive strategies such as mating disruption. So we are still dealing with this with brown marmorated 15 years on. And one of the ways we can think about trying to deal with this, and these are these area-wide pest management strategies where you take the best of the best IPM strategies and your biocontrol agents to leverage all of this to reduce populations across the landscape. So we've done this for brown marmorated. We're hoping to do this for lanternfly in the future. And finally, we get to climate change. So, all of these data that we generate help inform the models that many of you have been talking about. But, none of this happens in a vacuum. We end up with the situation where we can have biocontrol agents that are no longer sort of climate matched with the target pest. And we can have range expansion and contraction and potential new hosts for these invasive species. So it's just really complicated, Marty. And so with that, just some key messages. And really, once an invasive species is detected and established, we are always playing catch up. I think it's always good, and it is Captain Obvious, but having those short, medium, and long-term priorities to really inform what needs to be done, because a lot of times results are needed almost in real time. Quantifying impacts are critical. Human-assisted hitchhiking can contribute to spread. And also just initial management efforts. You're going to, we have to rely on insecticides to put out the fire, and this is going to lead to increased cost, IPM program disruptions, and secondary pest problems. Definitely, when one of these things hit, it requires transdisciplinary teams, robust funding, and ample time to get there. It takes a long time. And climate change is just going to add to additional complications to distribution, host distribution, and again, efficacy and match with biocontrol agents. And so with that, I just want to thank our diverse funding sources that we've had for both of these projects and the teams of folks that have worked on it. So that's it. Did it.
Very good. Mike's already got a hand up.
How effective is Priceocus now where you've got it established?
So we have a paper, if we can ever get it out, Mike, showing correlations between Trisochus populations and brown marmorated populations. So potential evidence for density dependence. So maybe it's starting to reach a level where it's having an impact. We don't have the populations that we've had, and so I think it's contributing, but it's not the only answer,
But why wasn't that used from day one, introducing?
Trisochus?
Yep.
So it was undergoing host specificity, and that has continued for a decade, I think. And so maybe maybe I didn't get your question.
No, you got that.
Okay.
I'm sorry, when you said a decade, I'm like, what's going on?
So there were some potential, so one of the non-targets that it was hitting was spine soldier bug. And so that became a concern because it is a predator. And so that kind of held it up. But then these adventive populations showed up. And so it kind of became a moot point because mostly where TJ showed up were the problem areas for BMSB. Now for lanternfly, still a huge.
If I can just
Yeah.
show you a stark contrast in use of biological control. So
Sure.
me, I discovered southern green stink bug in California.
Yeah.
3 biotypes of Trisochus from Europe. The entire investment was me. I released them, and it took care of southern green stink bug in about 3 years.
Yeah.
It's now hard to find. And
Yeah.
in the past, the pictures you showed were just what I was experiencing.
Yeah,
Processing tomatoes for 2 meters, we had 50 stink bugs.
sure.
But I'm
Well,
blown away by the lack of the
The-
focus on biological control.
Oh, no, there's a huge focus. I was just sort of, and it's always in there in the background, but it's always, you know what I mean? It's just one. First, we're trying to put out the fire and then we're trying to look for the long term, but
Well,
but I know what you're saying. Yeah.
Jim,
Yeah, a very naive question. So I read sometime back that because they're hunting rattlesnakes, the rattlesnake population is evolving to lose its rattles. Are any of these insects ever detected that are losing the pheromones that you're using in traps to detect them? Because they're bad for them.
Mm.
Is there any evidence that that would occur?
I can't think of, can you think of any, Shelby?
I think we trap such a small fraction of the population, it'd be
It's
hard.
not everybody.
Of course, rattlesnakes, you know, they catch very few.
There can be like some habituation to the pheromone, but they're driven by such need to mate that.
And we leverage that for mating disruption,
Yeah.
you know, so.
I'm curious, Tracy, tree of heaven is very attractive to spotted wing. Is it being used as a trap?
It-
Or,
Yeah, so part of the APHIS response was this hack and squirt idea. So you would keep a trap tree that would be treated, and then around those, take care of the additional
I
trees.
knew it wasn't a unique idea if I was thinking.
Well, it's also a problem because, you know, when they survey and they're 2,000 per square mile, you know, how do you remove all those?
It's hard for me to think of that as remaining a regulated pest when I have been in Pittsburgh and seen it absolutely covering trees.
Well, I think it's also a strategy to try to slow the spread, you know? But the tree of heaven, we have a verticillium wilt that we're looking at as a biocontrol agent for it as well.
The pathogens.
Yeah.
Good questions for Tracy.
I just wanted to add another thing to Mike, your comment. We have those agent-based models for brown marmorated stink bug. And one thing that I did with Shi Chen, right as I was trying to retire, was we added biocontrol. We just looked at mortality rates associated with any biotic agent, and we put it in at the rates that were showing up in the literature. And it was, in the models, it was dropping the populations so quickly that we found it hard to believe. And then I retired and we didn't get any farther than that. But I think it's not just Trisulcus, but adaptation of other generalist biocontrol agents that are really helping with brown marmorated, not at the leading edge, but
Yeah.
after that.
And Trisulcus for us, the Japonicus will only really forage in forested areas. That's where they mainly forage. They'll forage in row crops, like for brown marmorated and in soybean. You don't find them as often there, unfortunately. So that's part of the challenge with this pest.
Well, southern green sticks, I've got on every
Yeah,
tree fruit.
but I mean, did your Trisulcus forage everywhere?
Yes.
Oh, that was good. It's a good biotype.
Well, let's go ahead and grab lunch and kind of come back to your seats and we'll try, I'll give you a little bit of time to get started on lunch and then we'll start having some discussion while we finish up our meal. I've got some questions on the screen and we'll just kind of shoot those around. Originally, we thought we'd break into small groups. The room doesn't really lend itself to that very well. We thought we could go out there. We found out because we thought we might be able to go upstairs. We can't. So it's kind of like we have to look at it.